Welcome to the conversation. My name again is Shannon Taylor, Executive Director of Blacks and Jews in Conversation. My luck, they were ready to play a tape of my dear friend John Markham, who will be back here shortly when we share shows again with Let 'Em Talk, Paul DiRienzo, but it's premature, and I could have avoided coming here in the cold. And here I am, ready to go, give you a whole summary on Gaza and all other current issues. And when I'm ready to go, I'm ready to go. So tape or no tape. But it's good to see the face of John Markham again. And he'll be coming up in the near future for those of you who have estates, who have the unpleasantness of such business coming up or pending. Get ready, we'll give you that information. Meanwhile, we've never really addressed this issue. I've been waiting for the inauguration of the President-elect, Barack Hussein Obama, and the close of the issues in the Gaza for the time being in order to deal with it from beginning to close. And since I consider myself an expert on the matter, I really don't need anybody on the issues, and there's plenty enough to talk about, and so you're going to hear it straight from me. Let us say that, as I've said on many radio and TV shows from the beginning, that you are dealing with the most benevolent force in the history of nations when you're dealing with Israel. And I'll take issue with that with anybody, as I have. And most people won't even bother debating me on the subject. They just run the other way. The most benevolent force with Israel. And you are dealing with the exact opposite extreme with Hamas. They were about ready to put in effect crucifixion as a means of punishment, as well as beheading and cutting off hands and all other kinds of medieval and worse kind of punishments for all kinds of infractions under their type of law. And in came Israel after 7,000 rockets over 7 years, rockets extending all over the country, rockets that continued unabated even after Israel unwisely and against our advice and against the advice of, I don't know, half of their population at least, removed voluntarily, unilaterally, more than 21 cities at the border of Gaza and Israel. Cities that had been there 40 years, cities that contained from 10 to 12,000 people, cities that had the most productive organic crops and gardens that Mort Zuckerman and others bought and donated to the Gazans that Hamas destroyed and literally gnashed down and ground down with their own teeth, together with the synagogues that were left there as a sign of their total hatred for any accommodation, compromise, or desire to live with any other people in the area. As if that wasn't enough sign, certainly the fact that they continued to send rockets into civilian population areas, no matter what negotiations took place since the voluntary removal of the cities and their inhabitants, with great dissension from the entire population of Israel. The army was brought in, the police were brought in, and for some reason there was no real resistance because the Israelis trusted that their government would handle it well and resettle them and regret what they were doing, all of which of course didn't come to pass. There were reports that these police were only waiting for resistance so they could bash in the heads of these inhabitants, as they did in Amona shortly after, and we made trips to Israel where we confirmed by speaking to the Ammonans and seeing the video that that's exactly how the police handled themselves, and there were no arrests made, and there was no punishment handed out to the egregious injustice to those who didn't even resist the police. And yet the rockets came and the violence to the Jews came, and finally Israel begged Gaza for some unheard of reason. They begged Gaza. I remember seeing Olmert on TV, don't make us do this because we are stronger And of course, they might disbelieve that, considering his disgustingly failed efforts in Lebanon, where he sent soldiers to their death for all kinds of reasons from the beginning of the war to the end. But nevertheless, the Gazans said, we will continue to send rockets, we want to destroy you, we want to kill you, we want to wipe you off the face of the map, which was an echo of all the themes of the Arab nations in 48 when Israel was declaring independence. And so Israel sent in its troops slowly, first the air, nothing deterred the rockets, then the ground, and then from different parts of Gaza, encircling Gaza, cutting off Gaza, still the rockets came, and the rockets still come. And of course the leaders of Hamas, except for a few who grabbed their wives and their kids to sit with them to be bombed, they all went into the caves to hide out while they let all the other civilians of Gaza take the brunt of the blows, which were minuscule compared to every other army that has ever gone into an area. And if you look over military history as I have done, and you study military history as I have done, and you explore invading armies, and you see what happens when it is necessary to have preemptive attacks, and of course there's never been more provocation than from Hamas and Gaza here to Israel in any other case. You know there's going to be civilian casualties, and so Hamas exaggerates the potential by putting all of its ammunition and its rockets and its troops and its leaders next to the largest concentration of civilians, the schools, the hospitals, the largest population in homes, and to magnify the civilian deaths with the desired objective of their own type of propaganda. And they even announce on Al Jazeera and every other TV that they must embrace death. The goal is to embrace death. If you fear death, then you are doing a disservice to the cause. You must be ready to embrace death to free the land from the Jews. To annihilate the Jews and the Christians, one must be ready to embrace death. So you cannot be criticized for their strategy if you're part of their cause. And there's a certain logic to it from their point of view. And we're not dealing here with 72 virgins or the initial virgins or any kind of virgins. We're dealing here with a type of warfare which is their own. And to fight their type of warfare with our conventional warfare doesn't make any sense. To fight pirates in preceding centuries, the European and colonial American powers said that no law will apply. The pirates did not govern themselves by law, and therefore if you found a pirate, you shot him, you bayoneted him, and you hung him on the spot. No law applied to pirates who themselves did not govern themselves by law. The same would apply to terrorists, and the same would apply to anyone on the high seas or anywhere else that did not govern themselves by law, because otherwise you have a very unequal battle. You're doing a great disservice to your own soldiers. So here in Hamas, you have the Israelis fighting with both arms tied behind them. The Egyptians refuse to open the one border crossing they have, which would have easily allowed refugees out for safety, because Israel wasn't interested in bombing civilians, which has been, by the way, a common military tactic in the past, especially in siege warfare, is to starve the population. Certainly Israel wasn't doing that. Israel was doing quite the contrary. The only food, water, gas, oil, and all the rest of the supplies the population got was through Israel, not through Egypt. All the Arab allies abandoned the Gazans immediately, just like they abandoned the refugees since the very first beginnings of Jewish determination of reforming statehood of Israel. When all the Arab nations in 48, 47 said to the Arab population, and 70% listened and left, get out of there, we want to cleanse the area of Jews like the Nazis did in Europe, and 70% of the Arab population listened and left. But the Arabs never fulfilled their promise. They were defeated, and they never took in any of the Arabs who left. The same here in Gaza. They said to the Gazans, you defend yourselves, we'll help you. They never did. So it doesn't behoove the Israelis to do it. They've been attacked by 7,000 missiles. Nevertheless, unlike any other invading army, the Israelis, kept stopping all the time to let in the food and the water. What invading army ever does that? One invading army thereby allows Hamas, the enemy, to regroup, to regain its strength, to regain its breath, to regain its rockets. As every time Israel paused, they now aimed at Beersheba. They aimed at Ashkelon. They coordinated in the north in Lebanon to have rockets hitting in Nahariya and elsewhere. This was only made possible because of the pauses of the Israeli army. When you have an invading army waiting 7 years and 7,000 rockets, you go in, you go in. Your soldiers are vulnerable. I just heard at various places about the many, many Israelis who lost legs and lost arms and had shrapnel from neck to toe. You didn't see that on the media. You heard how few casualties Israel had and how many casualties the Gazans had. Well, the casualties the Gazans had was thanks to Hamas. But you didn't hear that commentary coming after their casualties. And for some reason, Israel was wrong to have few casualties. Why, it would have been better if more Jews had died? Does the world prefer when more Jews died? Is that the hidden logic here? Haven't we studied all through history, all through military history? Aren't all nations proud about what great success they've had, as in the Battle of New Orleans with Andrew Jackson, that Indian killer, how he wiped out 2,000 of the redcoats while only a few of his own men got killed? Isn't always the emphasis on how many of the enemy get killed and how few of your own, whether it's military or civilian? Don't you always emphasize in siege warfare or attack or battle how many died on the enemy and how few got killed of your own? Didn't it happen in the Kosovo War? How many our generals boasted they wiped out in the civilian population in Serbia, and how few casualties we took? Isn't that what the UN always aims for? And how is it different when Israel is involved? And how is it that the Jewish hospitals were so overlooked while at 5 times to 1, 10 times to 1, you looked at the casualties in Gaza? Israel gave every opportunity to Gaza to avoid this. And yet, Gaza wanted to bring it on. And yet, Hamas is still there. So what was accomplished? That's the final analysis. What is accomplished? Did Israel come and finish the job? Krauthammer wrote in the Daily News, the objective must be to finish them off, meaning Hamas, meaning the terrorist gang that has taken over Gaza. Otherwise, as now, the tunnels are being rebuilt. The smuggling continues. Egypt refused to send in food through its border crossing, refused to send in any kind of supplies until the last minute, until the last-ditch effort, until the very end, when they finally allowed something. But now it's up to Egypt to stop the smuggling and close the tunnels, and we don't see any of that taking place. We see the rockets continuing. We see the smuggling continuing. Just like in Lebanon, the international force will do absolutely nothing. All of Hezbollah is completely rearmed in Lebanon, more so than before, and yet their international force only prevents Israel from coming in. Casualties for nothing on the Israeli side, for nothing. And if you allow Hamas to remain, how long before they send 3 times more rockets to make up for this humiliating exercise? Are they going to be allowed to stay in power? Are they going to be allowed to control Gaza? And if so, then what was gained? Meanwhile, I read in the New York Post that the President-elect Obama has given his first formal TV interview on an Arabic cable network. He taped the interview with Al Arabiya as his envoy to the Middle East, Senator George Mitchell, set out on a trip. And what I told him is to start by listening, because all too often the United States starts by dictating. Well, does the President-elect, I'm sure he does, know that every Arab potentate in the entire Middle East is a dictator? There isn't one Arab leader in the entire Middle East that is not a dictator. So are we supposed to listen to the dictators? And George Mitchell is an Arab American. And he has been on previous stories to the area, and he has consistently condemned Israel. I don't know how anybody can say he is fair any more than Ambassador Holbrooke is fair. And I've met Holbrooke many times. He's a good friend of an old friend of mine, Les Gelb. He's a charming personality. He's extremely well-read and knowledgeable, and he also is not fair on Israel. And neither is Hillary Clinton, who I've also met. Senator Clinton, now Secretary of State. This is a team that is not enamored with Israel, having Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria. And what is it with all the Jews who are so anxious and so happy to see America get so involved in Israel? Don't you realize that the greatness of President Bush with Israel was that he left Israel alone? He may have talked about a Palestinian state, but thanks to the Arab intransigence and outright hatred of everything Jewish and Christian, nothing came of it. But with envoys such as this, all you will hear continuously is the intransigence of the Jews. And the Jews who sit here comfortably in their own homes without missiles coming at your hearts, without terrorist bombs striking at your throats, what right do we have to say that Israel must give up its homes and its lands and make those missiles and bombs come closer and closer? And certainly what right do organizations who are there to make Jews stronger have a right to talk about making Jews weaker? Look at this last war in Gaza, where more Jewish blood was spilled, where Jews in the teenage years came to fight and to see at the end of the battle, at the end of the smoke, that the rockets are still going to come. I would have my own suggestion. The 21 cities of dispossessed Jews taken away from the border, which were possessed of the most lovely structures and hard-working people, productive people, all employed, who are now divorcing, whose children don't know what to do, whom Israel has not resettled, whose crops and whose organic food fed the world, who had water and who were providing a stable basis and security when soldiers were not needed in the numbers they are now to defend the country, who kept rockets from going into the hinterland of Israel. Cities that provided a buffer zone, cities that kept Hamas under wraps, cities that provided a stable barrier and a growing community. These cities should have been reestablished. That would have been a lesson to the world that Jews don't tolerate any more violations of ceasefires. And if you're going to answer Jews' attempts to have peace with more and more violence, this is what comes back. Not only 21 cities, but 42. They should have rebuilt 42 cities with more gardens and more crops. And these settlers could have handled the matter permanently, instead of having soldiers come and soldiers go and soldiers come and soldiers go and more casualties on everybody's side. This is the cycle that could be broken by having some sense, not by having failed envoys of the past, failed envoys who continue the same missions they failed under President Clinton. Why bring back the same failed missions with the same failed people? In Ireland they did good work, but Israel is not Ireland. The greatness of George Bush with regard to Israel is that he did not bring back all of the failures of the past. And at least there was a status quo. The mistakes Israel made, such as removing those 20 cities, were Israel's own. We don't need America to add to the problem. What George Bush did that was terrible was he destroyed the environment more. And this is where Obama is great. If you look at what the president has been doing, he's been creating wonderful environmental progress day by day. Day by day, he's been removing the terrible environmental oppressive laws that have been burdening the air and the water and the land in the last administration and from previous administrations. And hopefully he'll continue this. And I wish him all the great courage in doing so to save our planet, because our planet needs help. It needs help desperately. And nowhere else in the world is there as environmentally conscious a population as in Israel. And in those 21 cities that were destroyed by Gaza, there was an environmentally conscious population with its gardens, as I mentioned, and its organic crops and its water. And if you look at what Israel has done with water, as was once done as an exhibit at the Natural History Museum in New York, you'll see that Israel was a pioneer in supplying water to fertilize crops all over the world. nations have benefited from the scientific experiments that Israel has progressed with in dealing with water and in making the land bloom and the desert bloom. Learn from Israel, learn from its science, and learn from its environmental progress. 50% of the population belong to the Society of Preserved Nature in Israel, which we have visited with, and its bird sanctuaries and its animal reserves in Israel. This is what we need to bring to our Arab friends, to encourage them to love wildlife and species preservation. And this is what I hope Obama is going to bring in his messages to the Arabic community, so that we can all share in preserving the land. I want to add that we again had the privilege, as I mentioned with my last guest last year, of opening the court system to the Kingsborough John Jay Colleges of Criminal Justice, and another wonderful article in the Brooklyn Eagle with announcements in the New York Law Journal. This makes our third such press coverage, feature articles, in the last several months. And we remain open to touring students through our law persuasions throughout the court system. I would also add that the Serbian student who stomped on the head, allegedly, of the poor Binghamton student about half a year ago, where we had traveled to Binghamton several times in the past, and he then sought refuge in Serbia, now is parading around Serbia and visiting the parliament and saying how he'll never come to the United States, and Senator Clinton and Senator Schumer have been totally ineffective in getting him back extradited to the United States, because there are no treaties of extradition, and Serbia thumbs its nose at the United States. And this is an appalling situation. This was an outright hate crime. This was not just a barroom brawl. This was an outright display of violence unchecked, where the ambassador let him leave the country, where the sheriff let him out of the jail. It's unbelievable. It would be made into a movie. It's so outrageous. And that this is allowed to take place while people thumb their nose at Jews and at justice, it just should not be tolerated, and it cries out for justice. At least the process should take place. I'm not commenting on the merits or the lack of merits. I'm not saying who's guilty, who's not. I'm saying that a trial was prevented, and that is what is needed here. And we should have our voices never stilled, and we should be crying out all the time to have justice done. And I'm not an enemy of Serbia. God knows, I know the Serbians helped the Jews in the Holocaust, and have been the bravest of fighters against Hitler and other tyrants. And this guy has come to symbolize a part of Serbia, and that is wrong. This is not the kind of symbol that Serbia should want to have. We've done programs with Serbia in this organization, and it should have a far better symbol, and should carry out justice, and should by all means have this trial. And for those of you who want to listen to the Arab media and hear the hate that comes out about Israel and about Jews and about Christians, please listen, and listen to Memory, and our sponsor, the American Israel Friendship League, can tune you into Memory, and you can hear the real hate. And we just heard a wonderful speaker, David Ben-Invri, from the American Israel Friendship League for Americans for a Safe Israel, and he told about Joseph's tomb. And Joseph's tomb, one of the 28 sacred places under the failed Treaty of Oslo, still is supposed to be preserved. And it's first been partially rebuilt last year, and we can only visit it once a month, and in some terrible neighborhood in Shechem, which is our ancient homeland of Jews. Only once a month. I call upon everybody to help in the rebuilding of the tomb of Joseph the righteous, who brought us safely out of Egypt, who saw us and the Egyptians through the famines, who was beloved by Egyptian and Jew alike. Joseph's tomb was ransacked and destroyed, and the Torah scrolls burnt to the ground by a mob in the Intifada II in 2000, and it is now necessary to restore it to its righteous glory, and we must have this as a symbol of intergroup dynamics, to have every week, every day, missions to go and restore it. And I wish you well. Next week is part 2 of the interview with Professor Chapman, and hopefully we will see better times ahead, environmentally, in Middle East, and peace, blacks and Jews. Shannon Taylor wishing you well, and for the future we should have a happy good year in 2009.